After a few long but exciting days in Las Vegas for the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, Alex and I are back in our respective homes. But the content never sleeps because Nvidia has just revealed the RTX 50 series Blackwell architecture and specs in detail, along with new DLSS and neural rendering features. But luckily, we've got a bona fide graphics expert here to explain in Digital Foundry's Alexander Battaglia. So Alex, are you ready to dive into Blackwell?
Yeah, basically we got, as part of an Editor's Day bonanza, a whole bunch of background information that will be also going out to the public. But over this, 6-hour period where we sat down and listened to engineers and presentations, through this info and working through it, we can distill it for you in the audience to give you even more information about these upcoming GPUs.
Yes, well, I certainly hope. We did have a very in-depth Editor's Day briefing in Las Vegas, and it was certainly quite the information bonanza, as you say. So I think we want to start with the Blackwell architecture, broadly speaking, with a focus on the new SM design to start with. So this has actually seen some pretty significant overhauls relative to Ada Lovelace. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah, basically, they are constantly changing the SM with each generation that has happened since Turing. Well, with Ada probably being the one that is the least different from its predecessor. But back when Turing launched, they introduced something new where at the same time as the SM could issue and process floating point 32-bit, like maths, it could also concurrently work on integer math 32-bit. And this was done back then specifically for Turing because they said they profiled a lot of games and they found that 35% of the time the GPU was working on integer math when also working alongside the floating point math. And they thought we could get more performance out of the SM by allowing it to do it concurrently at the same time. And, that 35% would mean technically things could be completed in a shorter amount of time. That actually went away with Ampere. They got rid of that feature and instead focused on this dual issue floating point unit. And I don't know, that's been not so interesting. Actually, we haven't really noticed, the inflated teraflops numbers really having a great bearing on scaling. It's kind of scaled as if it has just been half that number, more or less, in a lot of titles. So they're bringing this back essentially, but while keeping the dual issue floating point. So it's kind of like dual issue floating point and integer. And we'll have to see over a number of titles over time, but if it is anything like Turing, maybe it will have actually a positive influence on performance that goes out of step with the increase in amount of SMs total versus the previous architecture. But once again, we'll have to see while actually doing the benchmarks in the games.
Yeah, that would certainly be encouraging and a nice change of pace because, like you said, that dual issue functionality across vendors even hasn't seemed to result in much of an improvement thus far in PC graphics.
Right.
But there is another aspect to this architecture that's quite interesting in that the Tensor Core now supports FP4 acceleration, which I think is a pretty big development for a lot of machine learning workloads because it's often used for quantized models where you essentially lower the precision of a model and you get better performance, you get better memory usage, much more lightweight models that can actually run on GPUs. So this is very important for a lot of local AI workloads that gamers would have, and presumably it's going to come into play with things like neural rendering features of different kinds. Is that kind of along the lines of your thinking there, Alex?
Yeah, that's how I would see it too. And I think this is why they're touting the transformer model as being 4 times as compute laden as before, because essentially they are going to be able to do more at this lower precision. And Blackwell specifically supporting this will make it as fast as possible for these new models that they're going to be using to accelerate things like DLSS, or I presume a number of the other neural rendering features. We don't have those details at the moment, would also be leveraging this specific format. And with that being said, though, this you'll get the advantages of potentially lower memory usage, as well as the speed up on Blackwell. But technically, this FP4 could also run on any of the previous architectures too. It just wouldn't have the same level of acceleration, but it could obviously have the benefit of lower memory usage. So that is one of the reasons potentially. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why there, but this could be one of the reasons also why they do actually make mention very specifically of DLSS 4 having a lower memory usage than in the past, for example, the frame gen version of it. But yeah, that's something just to talk about. That will, whether or not we see, like, we don't know the numbers yet and the differences between the performance of the CNN and the transformer model, but this could be one of the reasons why Blackwell runs that better than the previous generation.
Right, yeah, that would certainly make a lot of sense. But another key facet of modern graphics rendering is ray tracing. And we have a new RT core, which according to Nvidia is built for Mega Geometry, which is very enticing. I think you'll agree. And they make some pretty big changes actually to the RT core. Just looking through the slides here, it seems like a more sophisticated, beefier RT core design relative to Ada, with some new hardware features as well. So could you kind of run through that, Alex? What's going on there exactly?
So yeah, the generic thing that they've been doing with each generation of the RT core has been to improve the throughput of the amount of ray box intersections and ray triangle intersections that it can do. It's usually doubled each time. And this time, I believe they are also increasing that. But the largest thing is indeed the hardware support for Mega Geometry. Now, it's been said to us directly multiple times, as well as in the QA session thereafter, that RTX Mega Geometry, this new way to essentially rapidly build the acceleration structure without having to do full rebuilds of it constantly with each LOD change, for example, that this is actually supported throughout the entire RTX line of GPUs. It is an API change. It's supported in NV API, etc. But I believe very specifically in Blackwell, there are added in hardware units here, as it's described, to make it faster than it would be on the previous generation. So you get like software support of it on old gen, but hardware support of it on the new gen. And those are two things there. They mention a triangle cluster intersection engine. This is basically the way the triangles are going to be batched up and streamed in and out into the acceleration structure, which makes it fast. And apparently they can intersect with it using a specific hardware unit, much like they have a hardware unit that just deals with ray box and ray triangle intersection. So it's like a cluster intersection unit. Another thing that they mention is triangle cluster decompression engine. Now, this is interesting because we don't actually have full details yet as to how Mega Geometry very specifically works. And I imagine it is done with some form of compression. And there's been research into this into the past. The last series of RTX GPUs, Ada Lovelace RTX 4000, supported something called displaced micromaps, or DMMs. And this was NVIDIA's, maybe I would say, first attempt to try and solve the issue of how do we ray trace against a bunch of triangles. But if I recall, there was separate research and papers looking into the fact that DMMs were not, in their form, at least as initially implemented, weren't very good for like animated geometry. I think there was like issues with seams and things like that, as well as the fact that it wasn't going to be supported by a large breadth of hardware. This, though, to me, this decompression engine, triangle cluster decompression engine, implies to me that there is something similar going on, maybe, but we'll have to see until they release maybe more of the white paper on this, as well as I presume there's going to be things like demos and things like that, because developers will want to learn more about how to use it. But the basic idea is that I'm getting is that Blackwell here has hardware for support for something that is going to be done via software in the previous generation, presumably leading to just it running a good deal faster.
Yeah, certainly still some questions there, in particular around that very tantalizing Mega Geometry demo that we saw a few days ago. That was certainly quite compelling, I think you'll agree. But there's other features here as well. There's a new AI management processor, which to me seems to basically be a response to increasing graphics and non-graphics use of AI in games where you might need to fit a language model in alongside frame generation, super resolution, other AI tasks.
Yeah.
But they do kind of mention here that it's a bit of a more forward-looking aspect of the Blackwell architecture because games that are mixing in a lot of those different kinds of like graphics and non-graphics AI tasks are not terribly common at the moment, in part because of the slow speed of game development, and also because, which I think we'll return to later, but the consoles aren't really set up to accelerate these tasks, especially the PlayStation 5. But this is a pretty interesting feature that could pay dividends in some of these more future-looking, more advanced kinds of workloads that we might see, into the next console generation and things like this, like deep into the future here.
Yeah, I think this is more like the nth goal dream stuff that we heard through the Microsoft leaks of basically an entire Xbox that is dedicated to the largest leap in whatever performance in console history, which is all about ML performance, and it would be leveraging things like local models to run something. We don't, whatever the game developer decides and whatever the research allows by that point in time. And right now, at least Blackwell is going to be very good at supporting it. The example they gave was basically like a question of latency. The scheduling would allow it so that like you had an AI local language model for talking with an NPC character, and to get rid of that weird fourth wall breaking pause every single time you would talk to them, the AI, the AMP, would essentially schedule that to be coming in closer when you activate it, so it wouldn't be, farther behind in latency in the rest of the pipeline, so you wouldn't get as long of a pause. That was what they described it as like the future concept there. There was like a little bit of demoing of it, but the entire gist is that this is not at all something that really is super practical for most recent games, like at least in the next like 3 years as I see it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very forward-looking technology, but perhaps the technology that's going to mean more to gamers in the here and now and more to their power bills potentially is Max-Q, which has basically become, I think, Nvidia's branding for their various power management techniques and technologies. I do remember that in the past, Nvidia used to offer laptop parts designated as Max-Q, and that was basically their brand for their lower TGP parts there. But here it looks like that, that's been over time more broadly applied to their entire product line. And here it looks like they've improved their frequency switching on Blackwell to be more responsive. They've also improved some sleep behavior that might be going on. So can you kind of explain what's going on with Max-Q in Blackwell?
Yeah, basically, since they can switch the frequency much more rapidly, it's going to be sub-frame, I'm pretty sure, at least at reasonable frame rates. That they can essentially turn off more and more parts of the GPU depending upon what is happening in any one given frame or even over multiple frames. Because if you think about it, a GPU is doing a whole bunch of work. A good some of it is in parallel, with like async compute and stuff and such, as well as, in the past, they've made it so that Tensor cores can run or RT workloads can run concurrently with other ones. But for large portions of a frame, big chunks of the GPU will actually be turned off. And while they do this, what they do is depending upon the amount of time in between some of these things occurring, like they will put that part of the GPU into a lower like power state, sleep state almost, and it'll eventually kind of flatten out at the very bottom if not a lot is occurring. And this allows them to increase versus the previous generation the amount of power per, I don't know how you'd say it, like it's like power for performance yielded, Oliver, like
efficiency.
Basically. My brain is scattered at the moment. It essentially is improving the efficiency of the chip. Well, which makes sense because they actually the die shrink isn't essentially there to would have allowed what we would have previously seen, for example, between RTX 3000 and RTX 4000. So they need to come up with smarter, essentially software and hardware based ways on a relatively same process node to get better efficiency there. And that's one of the ways they're doing it. For the desktop chips, this is important, obviously, to lower your power bill, but it's also extremely important for laptops where you'll have a limited wattage budget there, and you kind of want to fit as much in as possible to yield the most amount of performance and battery life possible. So I'd say that's where most users will notice it, but also things like fan speed ramping up, all these things, there's just going to potentially be a good deal better in Blackwell, which is good to see actually.
Yeah, I personally do think that a lot of these technologies are very compelling, in particular for laptop users, and we'll touch on this later, but I think DLSS 4 is really going to be quite a defining technology for the more power constrained and maybe performance constrained parts in the Blackwell lineup, but we can talk about that in a minute. But there are also some very notable improvements, closing things out here, in the display engine, because now it supports DisplayPort 2.1, and also the GPU
Right.
has notably improved hardware video encoding capabilities, especially in the 5090, that top-end GPU. So could you kind of walk us through exactly what those changes to the display engine and the video encoders, what exactly those mean for users?
Yeah, so for most users, I'm going to say actually it's not that huge of a difference. This
Hmm.
is more orientated around creators and video editors and such, or people maybe who use OBS quite a lot for streaming,
Right.
having more essentially encode and decode or encoders specifically for the RTX 5090. 3 is mooted there, will allow you to work on multiple streams, for example, in OBS, of very high quality streams, for example, and having them be encoded in real time or at the end of an export, for example, and just having the export be a lot quicker, or have the raw frame rate that you're uploading to Twitch, whatever, be less compromised. So that's essentially it there. I think for most people, though, this is just a nice added bonus feature. It won't be too much of a big deal. I think there's other aspects in there like better quality for bit rate that are mentioned, as well as better AV1 ultra high quality support. But once again, those are, I think most users won't take advantage of that. I think most people are more interested in things like a DisplayPort 2.1 and PCIe 5.0 support. Most games are not saturating PCIe 4.0, but for those games in the future where we see a greater interaction between CPU and GPU, which is just inevitable at this point in time, the consoles have it
Right.
way better off there. It's better to be future proofed as much as possible on something that is so stupidly powerful as an RTX 5090. Because we've seen in the past with games that are limited to 8x lanes, for example, or on motherboards that limit to 3.0. We've seen modern games from the PS5 generation or even PS4 generation, depending on the port, struggling as a result of that. Things like Ghost of Tsushima that I pointed out. And that is a very specific port where they actually emulated like the PS5 API on PC, according to their presentation at the Graphics Developers Conference in the Netherlands. And so any of those type of like strange console porting situations, you always want as much PCIe bandwidth as possible. And, Blackwell's good for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of these changes, in particular to the encoding side of things, will mostly benefit people working on like video content, like you said. Right now, like a 4090 can do 4K NVENC encodes at about 60 FPS for us, and a 5090 maybe,
Right.
according to their figures here, and according to the rough estimation of how long each would take, it probably could do 90 or 100 FPS. Not a gigantic difference, but certainly it would speed things up to some substantial degree. And it has some implications for those kinds of workloads if you are that kind of power user who wants to encode 4K video at a better than real-time speeds, which is certainly would apply
That's
to us
nice.
at least
Yeah.
some of the time. But I think that's kind of enough for our kind of broad architectural look at Blackwell as an architecture. But I think ultimately a lot of gamers are really just interested in those raw specifications, especially gamers who are coming from like RTX 3000 or 4000, maybe looking for an upgrade and looking through those bandwidth figures, looking at the memory bus, looking at the number of cores, SMs, etc., trying to come to some conclusion regarding relative performance here. So what's going on? I think we should probably start with those two highest end cards, the 5090 and the 5080. What should we make of those two cards? And what should we make of the pretty big specs gulf that I think separates them? What should we make of all those factors there, Alex?
Yeah, so the spec differentials between RTX 5090, which is a Halo product, versus the RTX 5080, which is the current highest end product below it, are actually some of the largest we've ever seen in any of the NVIDIA generations before this. RTX 3090, for example, and RTX 3080 had a gulf, but it was, reserved mainly to being most noticeable on the highest end RT titles, or technically those titles that had a lot of VRAM usage, which at the time of launch wasn't many actually. Scroll ahead to now, we've got the RTX 5080 on the spec sheet saying 56 shader T-flops and 105 for the RTX 5090. So on a theoretical level, at least, it is almost twice as powerful. That is a big deal, actually. I think we're going to see some very large differences in a number of titles, I think, specifically, especially those ones leveraging ray tracing. But vis-a-vis the last gen, that's a question we'll get to at the end of this video, like how good is it for the price? And we're going to have to wait for reviews for those sort of things, but you can already start talking about it now based upon other factors. Another thing to point out is that the RTX 5080, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, much like the 40 series before it, while the RTX 5090, with its increased memory bus size, 512-bit versus 256-bit of the RTX 5080, well, it's now racking 32 gigs of VRAM. Not very useful for modern games. This is more the RTX 5090 is seen as a super high-end Halo product for creators, for people running like local machine learning, or for people editing 4K video or 8K video. That is really useful. But even if you tap out games to like 4K DLAA with all the stuff maxed out, you're not going to be seeing 24 gigs usually filled in any game. And that's already talking about games that are using full ray tracing with high quality textures and all that. So I think this is more just a future-proofing creator thing, but it is a pretty big divide here between RTX 5080 and 5090. And as we get to the end of this video, we'll see that, that may be a pretty big deal. Another part of this is that the price, the theoretical performance on paper is half for the 5080. The price is also half. It's $999 MSRP there for the new Founders Edition version, and it's $1,999 US dollars, $1,999 US dollars for the RTX 5090. So it is a price bump versus the RTX 4090.
So yeah, Alex, I mean, I personally find the 5090 to be a very interesting GPU because I think it's clear to me that Nvidia is kind of looking at that top end of the market and maybe just pulling it up a little bit because they know they're at the top. They don't have any other competition except themselves. And I feel like they're kind of pushing that up a little bit, pushing the price up a little bit to match. But I actually do think if you look at these bar charts here, I did some quick pixel counting, albeit not
Genius.
Pixel counting of the usual type, pixel counting the bar charts. And they're basically saying that in non-multi-frame gen workloads, you can probably expect about a 30% performance increase relative to the 4090 in titles like Resident Evil 4 and titles like Horizon Forbidden West. So it is pretty gigantic, and the cooling requirements are more substantial. But that is a pretty decent increase. That's kind of comparable, I think, to what you would have seen with a lot of 20 series cards relative to the 10 series. Maybe
Yes.
not the biggest generational uplift in NVIDIA's history, but also not a small uplift, certainly. For the 5080, it's a smaller improvement. It's more like 15%. Again, before MFG is factored in, which we can discuss later. And also that's not factoring in games that might use like extensive neural rendering of different types and things like this that might actually push that out further, you might imagine.
Yeah.
These are older existing titles. So in general, I think it's definitely a case where, on the lower end, what you're looking at is you're looking at pretty much price parity with the outgoing GPU products or similar prices to the outgoing GPU products there. But you're getting a decent uplift in performance, not huge, but decent. And then the MFG. And on the high end, you kind of just get to play with a die that's getting closer to that reticle limit, and it's giving you more of that real high-end power there for a higher price, but not really a hugely higher price, I think. That being said, NVIDIA has a very interesting cooling solution that actually enables both of these cards, at least their Founders Edition variants, to be pretty slim and sleek two-slot designs. So could you explain NVIDIA's new flow-through cooling design and methodology here, Alex? Because it is very novel with these higher-end 50 series cards.
Actually, yeah, this is one of the coolest aspects and was pretty surprising when they did show it off, is the fact that it is a two slot for the RTX 5090 and RTX 5080. RTX 4000 specifically, RTX 4080, 4080 Super, etc., and RTX 4090 all share the same really large cooler, 3-slot, thick, a lot like the RTX 3090 before, unlike the RTX 3080, which was very thin for the FE version. And now we have them turning to this design which allows airflow to go through in a straight manner through the entire card. And they have moved from like this reverse kind of fan on one side, fan on the other side at opposite ends of the GPU, to have them being on both one side of the GPU and slimming it down. The heatsink is itself a lot smaller as a result. And the reason why they're able to do this is probably because of the new PCB being smaller. It's no longer like that kind of like arrowed V shape that it was previously, but it's actually 3 separate PCBs, one for PCIe, one for IO display, and then the other one is actually like the GPU and memory surrounding it. And it's a lot smaller as a result of that. And it allows for this new super competitive design. And it actually does make me wonder what the whole point of an AIB card is anymore, the board partner cards, because this thing looks ridiculously competitive. It is sleek, it is suave, and it's going to maybe be MSRP wise one of the lower ones, depending upon what ends up happening. You know, it's Nvidia has all this money and research to leverage into such a design, but it is like, it's making me call into question what's the point for something like this. When we get into the 5070, we'll talk about something different there. Yeah. But it's you know, this one, it's pretty awesome looking, and I'm happy in terms of for making a case and whatnot. Like, you don't have to get the super long, super wide, worrying about whether or not a PCIe lane or a PCI 1X lane is going to be covered. This will just be like kind of like an older GPU before things started getting really ridiculous.
Yeah. I certainly am very sympathetic to that perspective, because I think this design is very clever in a lot of respects. It's a great way to cut down on the size of the needed heatsink and get more efficient cooling performance. Like you said, by getting air to just flow straight through the card instead of needing to flow through and then be dispersed out slots on the side or be blown through the back of the card, or like all these different arrangements that involve the air changing direction. Now you're just getting that full flow through design, whereas in previous generations, like, you know, the Founders editions would have one that flowed through. Now it's both flowing through, and I think that's quite compelling. The only thing is that it requires a very, very tiny PCB to work. I don't know if the partner PCBs are the same as NVIDIA's PCBs in this respect for every card. That's going to be certainly a question.
Yeah, that's another thing to know. And just if anyone wants to get a little bit like up close and personal look of that, there's actually a great video from PC World. Adam Patrick Murray, who you and I both met there, made a video about it, talking with an NVIDIA rep. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, but I would completely echo Alex's comments here also with regards to the partner cards, because, and we should have some footage going on screen here, but I got right up and close and personal, and so did Alex, with these partner cards, and they look monstrous in comparison. They're like 3.5, 4 slots. They just look huge relative to the 5090 and 5080 Founders editions, which look really nice and really slim. Some of the higher end 5090s have liquid coolers, which is a bit of an exception though. And I did note that the MSI Special Edition 5090s actually also appear to use that dual flow through design. So at least those must have this miniaturized PCB design there. But they do look a lot meatier than the Founders Edition 5090. So I think it's kind of a shame, because these are really nicely engineered graphics cards. In prior generations, I'd say the Founders Editions were like competitive with some of the better board partner cards, but in this case, I'd say that it's clearly a really nice design, probably a better design than a lot of those board partner cards. And it's a shame this probably won't be as widely available as those cards will be, obviously, because it is a Founders Edition product.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do. Does leave a bit of a sour taste in the mouth when Nvidia is kind of clowning the field like this. And, you know, I'd love to see that card more widely distributed, or at least for board partners to get the picture, and maybe this time around CES 2026, everyone's adopted this design and we're seeing a ton of board partners with it. So that would at least be a nice outcome here. But those aren't the only desktop cards that have been revealed in this showcase, because we have the 5070 and 5070 Ti, which are maybe a little bit less exciting from a spec perspective than something like that chart-busting 5090 that's going to blow past any 4090 series benchmarks that we've seen so far. And they also use a more conventional cooler design, but actually these come in priced pretty competitively with some of the outgoing products, more competitively than I thought they would be, right?
Yeah, specifically, I think everyone after the show And immediately during the show, when Jensen Huang was doing his presentation, they saw that slide of RTX 5070 equals RTX 4090. We'll talk about that momentarily, but for the price, the cool price of $549, the price of the 70 series line of GPUs has been going up ever since the GTX 1070. Pretty radically. Obviously, we have stuff like GTX 970 being one of the best price performance GPUs ever released. 10 series was also really good, especially as you start going up the stack. But then you get to RTX 2070, and that for the time was, for its price, expensive. Over time now we've seen it kind of proving itself versus Pascal before it, but definitely on release it didn't seem or feel that way at all. It was actually bad in that aspect. You get to RTX 3000, it's another story of that light, but you start getting caveats to those 70 series cards, and that's kind of what we see here. The base RTX 5070 for its performance profile still has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, much like the 40 series before it, RTX 4070, RTX 4070 Super, for example. And that is, I think, like the cold water on the fire for a lot of people. We'll get to that at the end of this video more, but that is a big distinction here. The RTX 5070, using the more classical heatsink fan design for the FE version, 549, 12 gigs of VRAM. Or they say it's like RTX 4090 power, but that is talking about using multi-frame gen. For the RTX 5070 Ti, boost in specs in terms of shader T-flops, as well as all the other things. It's also going to have 16 gigs of VRAM, which I would say is good. It's putting it more in that like original RTX 4080 level. But gen on gen versus like the previous versions, it's like similar to what you described with the RTX 5080, right? This GPU. Not super large gen on gen stuff in the previous titles. The examples they gave are interesting because they constantly are using Horizon Forbidden West here, right? As well as Resident Evil 4 games that, they have some legacy components in them, and they were targeting cross-gen to a certain degree. And you also have a very low usage of things like ray tracing. Forbidden West, 0 ray tracing, and Resident Evil 4, as I described in my review,
bad ray tracing.
So, these are showing, I would say, like the raster performance gen on gen difference. For games that are using more RT, it actually could be larger, but that is not what Nvidia talked about, because whenever they showed any of those games, they would want to throw up the MFG result. Essentially, you're getting 2.9 times higher smoothness than the previous gen in such titles. Here we've got 549, 749, both of which look on their face as good prices. They're not as heavily increased as a lot of people would have rumored beforehand, but there are caveats there which make people, I would say, consider these GPUs.
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that Nvidia is basically telling us at the same settings, with the same kind of DLSS going on, with the same ray tracing, whatever, they should be 20%-ish fast. That's what they quoted to us here.
Right,
but how fast those will be in practice, we'll have to test that, of course. And then, of course, the big selling point here is that you get that MFG result, and all of a sudden you are indeed looking at something that is much, much, much more powerful in practice, but the utility of frame generation and its relative merits at different internal frame rates and things like that, that's a whole different discussion we'll have at the end of this whole thing. And also I would note, like, a lot of the partner cards in this, we did see some partner cards, and they are big. They're still pretty big. Most of them are still pretty big. There are some dual slots in there, but most of them are pretty substantial. So for sure, you do want to be discriminatory in your picking of different cards there, and make sure you pick the right one for you, and maybe don't pick one of the 4-slot 8-pound ones, perhaps.
No, please.
But moving on from desktop graphics, because I know we here at DF don't focus as much maybe on laptop graphics performance, but that is a key market. There are a lot of laptop gamers out there, and I actually think Blackwell looks pretty interesting for laptops. So what does Blackwell bring to laptop gamers, Alex?
Yeah. So there's the exact same naming and numerology to the laptop line of GPUs with no M designation, no max Q designation like you
Yeah.
lament, Oliver. So these are RTX 5090, 5080, 5070 Ti, RTX 5070 for laptops. And as we know, laptops are thermally and power constrained. They are going to not be like the max, they recommend 1,000 watt for an RTX 5090. One of those running in a laptop, potentially on battery, is not going to be targeting that level of power supply, right? So
Yeah.
they mention here very specifically at the top end that it's going to be with the RTX 5090 1490 performance. But once again, with that large star next to it that says, oh, they're presumably meaning with multi-frame gen. So I would see
Yeah.
here desktop level RTX 5070 kind of for the top end. And I imagine actually it might be a little bit lower due to, once again, just power and thermal considerations. And then going down the stack, it kind of goes down into, these are almost like, like for me, it's in my brain what if 5070 would be like, then a 5060 Ti, then a 5060, and it's going down, right?
Right.
This naming is not very helpful for the average consumer, I would say. But there's more to it. Like we talked in our previous video, looking at that Razer laptop. It's smaller, thinner, more power efficient. The Blackwell features in regards to power gating that we talked about earlier, the new Max Q stuff, that's all going to help this design run better than the previous generation within the same power envelope. But another thing that they mentioned was an interesting use case for machine learning, and they call it battery boost, motion detection, essentially for limiting the thermals and power of the GPU. And in this case, I think they're using the example, maybe what was Baldur's Gate 3. I can't exactly recall specifically, but basically,
I think it is, yeah.
Looking at how much change is going on per frame, probably with a variety of inputs there, just like color, whatever, tracking pixels over frame. And they can then throttle up and down the GPU. And I think their target for full throttle is 60 FPS, and then half that for when it's going to start downclocking. So in a movement heavy scene, you'll be getting the GPU in its full, presumably, and then a low movement scene, like typical conversation, it would be using the lower power profile and targeting 30 FPS. Now, I'm not one to love constant changes in frame rate, but this is another option for the power discerning gamer out there who games on the go. So it's just another option. But what do you think about that, Oliver?
I think it's an interesting technology. It is maybe not the way that I would personally go. Like you said, I think that,
Right.
at least to me, I'm so attuned to differences in the frame rate that it would immediately bother me pretty quickly. But I also suspect that there are some really compelling technologies here. For Blackwell and laptops, I think DLSS 4 has to be at the forefront here,
Right.
in particular MFG, because you just might not need the same class of GPU to service a 1080p or 1440p or 4K display at high refresh rates in particular as you would before, as long as you're willing to accept some frame gen artifacts. Again, we need to see it in person to know exactly how impactful those will be at low internal frame rates, but accept that and accept some greater input latency, and it could actually be a pretty good experience. Like, I think laptop gamers are probably more tolerant to those kinds of artifacts. And when you decrease that base frame rate internally and you rely on MFG, you're likely to get a big power savings. So that could help you out both on battery and not on battery to sustain good levels of performance in demanding titles. Especially because I think for mobile gamers, probably they're happy to be at 120 FPS, probably happy to be at 160 FPS, something like that. They'd be ecstatic for those numbers, probably. And
Right.
this is a great technology to get you there that you didn't have before. But I think in terms of the general performance of this line, they only really shared performance info on the 5080 laptop, but they did say that you should expect similar kinds of performance gains across the whole family, which is like they quoted a 10 to 30% increase in performance. So yeah, that's kind of in line with the rest of the Blackwell series. I'd expect it just because of the DLSS 4-ness of it all, that actually could be a more compelling upgrade than the other GPUs in this architecture.
Right.
Because in desktop, maybe you aren't necessarily always dialing in that maximum frame gen, but on the laptop parts, I mean, it's giving you so much power savings in particular that I think it starts to become a lot more appealing potentially. So that's
Agreed.
something that I'm certainly interested in. But I think next up we should probably chat, and chat is possibly generous because I'm also going to leave this up to Alex because he is the expert here, really. But to chat or talk about some of the rendering features available on Blackwell and indeed across a lot of NVIDIA GPUs for many of these features. So first up, we have the neural shader, which, as far as I understand it, is a way to use tensor cores for graphics tasks using neural networks that's outside of the typical NVIDIA suite of DLSS and associated technologies. Is that about right, Alex?
That's about it. Basically, if you can go back in time, and they actually interestingly did this in the presentation, which is how I would have done it. They go through the introduction of like programmable shaders to things like the geometry shader, the tessellation, and Hall stage, and then eventually compute, and then to ray tracing. And those are different shader types that the GPU has in various stages. But now they're introducing a new one, the neural shader, essentially. And this is covered by a new API that will be coming out from Microsoft. I think it's going to be like a subsection of DirectX 12. I have no idea what they're going to end up calling it. I don't know if we're just going to be eternally in DX 12 or whatever, and just with this like little dashes and points afterward. Back in the day, they used to kind of do that, like DirectX 9.0A, 9.0B, 9.0C. They used to do that kind of thing. But that's more dev-centric stuff, but the whole point is it being covered by DirectX is going to make it much more easily accessible to developers. Also, the DirectX blog post mentions that Qualcomm, Intel, and AMD are on board. They're going to presumably present their own way to do this in the future. And for the gamer, though, you can kind of go back to the video we put out covering our CES demo and all these other things just on was it Monday? Yes, of this week, where we go through this NVIDIA booth and they showed off two very compelling technologies using these things. Neural materials, which is basically bridging the gap to offline film rendered materials, making games right now use very simplified models for performance reasons and also potentially memory reasons. But here, using these neural materials, running real time on the GPU, incredible performance speed up versus the offline stuff while looking really good. And the other thing that I think is going to be very relevant for RTX in the longer term future as well is this neural texture compression, where they're saying it should have like a 7-to-1 better level ratio of compression versus standard block compression formats, like, I don't know, BC5 or something. And this is interesting because it's a neat trade-off where we can only throw so much hardware into a GPU over an amount of time. And I think NVIDIA is constantly talking about this. And this is one way to leverage some of the few specialized hardware we do have, things like machine learning and tensor cores, and to increase the perceptual quality for the amount of disk space and space in VRAM. Now, the thing to point out, this neural texture compression is not like Kraken on the PS5 or anything like that. It's not taking a compressed format on disk and then uncompressing it into memory. What it is doing, it is taking that compressed format, bringing it over to GPU memory, and the machine learning is extrapolating upon it in real time in a deterministic fashion to make the texture look good. That is the compression. It is not going. The reason why it's important is because it uses less VRAM, where things like Kraken do not use less VRAM. They're about disk saving and as well as streaming speed. So this is a different type of technology. It's not like a decompression tech, for example. That's something different. So just so everyone knows that it's phenomenologically different. But yeah, that's kind of the usage for the neural shader there. Currently, we won't see much of this, and I think in the immediate short term, but this is something for years after the fact, as well as when the next Xbox comes out.
So there's another kind of key feature here, which is shader execution reordering, which I think NVIDIA introduced with the Ada Lovelace architecture. Has a lot of applications in terms of improving shader execution in ray tracing workloads, in particular in very divergent ray tracing workloads. So could you
Right.
explain what the kinds of improvements we're going to see in Blackwell are to that SER key feature?
Yeah, basically the problem with doing diverse and complex workloads on the GPU is that you start losing the inherent benefit of what a GPU is, a massive parallel processing unit. Shaders work in that way. That's why we have so many shaders, and we only have, up to like 16 cores on like a standard high-end CPU. They're a lot smaller and less capable in some aspects than a normal CPU core, but in parallel, they're really great, and you can keep stacking them up and you'll still see scaling. Things like path tracing, harder ray tracing workloads, divergent workloads of any type. This will also happen in compute shaders of any variety too. Will just decrease the amount of throughput that you're getting. You're just not going to be as efficient. So things like SER are kind of batching the workloads up into ways where they can be handled more efficiently instead of wasting the amount of lanes available at any one moment and waiting for the next cycle. And this was introduced and demoed and used in games through shader execution reordering. Essentially, it's a different API call versus standard DirectX ray tracing. So you'd be using NVIDIA specific stuff there. And I think there's also a Vulkan version of it. So in Vulkan, it'd be an extension. And here they talked about being 2x efficient versus the previous implementation. So this is one thing the slides don't show off at all, but potentially without multi-frame gen on, we could be seeing path tracing games running a bit better on Blackwell versus Ada in a way that doesn't line up necessarily with the spec differentials and performance we see in rasterization games. Another thing they talked about it with this here is they also mentioned that it's just like they used machine learning workloads as another aspect of SER where it's going to be improving efficiency. And I think this is not talking about the current DLSS dynamic, but rather SER working for potential future neural rendering things. So like games that would use things like neural texture compression, and neural materials, or any other thing that developers cook up.
Okay, great. Now moving on to some of the more exciting and kind of sexy features, I think, in Blackwell and other NVIDIA GPUs here. We've got RTX Mega Geometry, which is designed to handle scenes with incredible geometric complexity. And it really is quite something to observe in motion. So could you kind of go through this? Obviously, we've already discussed this at some length in DF Direct, but could you kind of give us a little primer on what has been disclosed here with RTX Mega Geometry?
Yeah, as I described there, RTX Mega Geometry is solving the problem that for really complex and moving geometry or changing geometry due to the level of detail changing, the current ray tracing APIs leave much to be desired there. That's why Unreal Engine 5 has nanite, so you can get up close to an object and see all the nice polygons there, but the ray tracing version of that scene is actually much lower quality. And as a result, the lighting will suffer. You cannot do things like direct shadows without switching over to VSMs, which have their own kind of trade-off in quality, performance, and memory. Basically, we want to have a way to make geometry that is movable, deformable, and LODable run better in ray tracing. And RTX Mega Geometry is their proposal for, like I described earlier in the architectural part of this video, a way to do this in hardware and in software, because there's an API associated with it. There's the MV API. And as I heard behind the scenes, there's also going to be Vulkan extensions. How and when this gets into DirectX is another question, but I'm presuming like everything NVIDIA does, there's a lot of talking quite a long time beforehand with Microsoft to get it up and running. Because don't forget, they demoed off DXR the first time on NVIDIA GPUs, and that API was most definitely made with NVIDIA GPUs in mind. So we'll see how this evolves in the future. But in the mid to short term, we're going to probably see this in some capacity in Unreal Engine 5 games. I imagine any of the stuff that is NV sponsored is going to be shipping with it, as well as it applies to any other modern game that uses things like mesh shading. So I'd imagine massive entertainment who made things like Outlaws and Avatar, would be adopting this in the future. We also saw an incredible usage of mesh shading in Alan Wake. They are going to be adopting it, and I believe there might be a patch for that game as coming as soon as January 30th, which would enable RTX Mega Geometry in that game. And it does, like I said earlier, apply to older RTX GPUs. We just don't know about the amount of speed up it will give there.
Right.
But this is only a good thing. It's the way the RTX APIs needed to evolve for the demands of future games, and we're actually seeing it now, and it's first from Nvidia.
Yeah. No, it's certainly a kind of mind-blowing demo, I gotta say, especially when they go over to the polygonal view and you see all those all that incredible noise there, and just how detailed those models can be. It's really quite something. But there is another technology here that might have some applications, some really compelling visual applications that you can see in games in a pretty short period of time, which is RTX Hair, which, as far as I understand it, is basically a solution to the problem of ray tracing in Hair. It's so complex, it's so challenging to light that using ray tracing. Here, there's basically a technique that's been worked out with optimizations that seem specific to Blackwell GPUs here that allow for Hair to be ray traced in a more efficient and effective manner and actually make it possible and plausible to do so in real-time rendering.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the architecture, another part of the new RT Core is the accelerated tracing against or intersection with, they call them linear swept spheres all throughout the presentation. But then we went to the booth and everyone was calling them something else, Landstrospheres. And I was like, I wasn't sure if my brain was tricking me. I think if we go over the recording, we hear that all the way in the booth. So maybe there is a marketing name and maybe there's an internal development name, kind of like you saw with PSSR, right? And yeah, so basically this is just a new primitive, as they call them, like the triangles of primitive, that can be traced against. And this is currently used in the demos here, as well as it's going to be coming to Indiana Jones. For things like Hair, it'll be giving apparently heavily increased performance versus doing it with triangles, as well as giving the same level of, visuals there, if not better. The question is how it will be used in the future. I don't know. It was hinted at that could be used for things that aren't just Hair and surprising ways. It was also not at all talked about what exactly happens on older GPUs. Would this be a feature that runs really fast on Blackwell, but then runs a lot slower on older GPUs? Or does it not run at all on older GPUs? I don't know. Another thing to mention is that this is going to be in Vulkan most likely, and it'll be an NV API, but DirectX, is still on version 1.1, which I think came out in like 2020-ish, 2021 maybe, when AMD brought out their RDNA 2 on PC. And so this will not be just like a standard DirectX thing for whenever, basically when Microsoft is not resting, but active, and, at least in a forward-facing manner. So yeah, this is interesting, but for now, we're going to see it mainly in NVIDIA-sponsored titles.
Yeah, I got to say, looking at these Indiana Jones screenshots that NVIDIA has provided, there is a very clear improvement in lighting fidelity in the RTX Hair on view, with Hair that has more of that kind of sheen and shine. It doesn't have like the artificiality to the shadowed regions. I think it looks quite nice there. It doesn't look overly smooth as video game Hair so often does nowadays. There are a few other features here that I think we want to work through as well. One of them is the neural Radiance cache,
right?
Which, as far as I understand it, is basically a way to accelerate and improve, hopefully, the quality of indirect lighting and ray traced scenes by caching, storing, retrieving that data, maybe giving you an opportunity to do more bounces through the scene, this kind of thing. Alex, could you kind of describe the NRC there?
NRC is something we talked about on DF Direct in the past, and I think I mentioned it once in some other video. Maybe it was one of my Tech Focus videos, but the basic conceit is that path tracing is very expensive. Doing multiple bounces past one or two is very expensive, and so games in the past, as well as with normal ray trace GI, will cache that into some sort of structure in the world, in screen space, like Lumen does, or, there's a lot of ways to cache these results and run them, in parallel, slowly over time, updating temporally. And this can lead to lag, and it can also lead to another bunch of negative phenomena. But it is a good way to get more than 1 or 2 bounces in a game world for certain things. NRC, based upon the research papers, neural radiance caching, works by actually doing the training on the GPU in real time. It is not just inferencing, it's training and inference at the same time, which is new. And it would be running on the scene right in front of you, and the lighting results that are being path traced in that moment. And then it's storing them. And then it is essentially allowing you to get more bounces over time. And you can actually tweak it so that you could get increased performance, because instead of sending out more rays over time to fill this cache, which would be usually in world space or screen space, you're now just kind of assuming them based upon the training. So it actually can increase performance. And they showed this in the demo, which was using Half-Life 2 RTX. It looked better. There was more nuanced, smaller, detailed lighting. Like they specifically called it out on the cobblestone streets here in Ravenholm, but it also ran a little bit better. I mean, we were already talking about pretty high frame rates here with MFG on, but it ran a little bit better. And once again, this is something that currently I imagine will only be really applicable to heavily RTX sponsored titles. We have yet to see it in any title released, but I presume it's coming to Half-Life 2 RTX as well as Portal RTX or whatever in the future. But other titles, I can't really say.
Okay, so there's also an interesting technology that, as far as I know, is not in the public domain as of yet, but was revealed in this little presser here, which is RTX Skin, which seems like a new method of doing subsurface scattering, albeit not in screen space, I would presume. Can you kind of go through this, Alex?
Yeah, basically, when we're ray tracing in real time in hardware, it is against triangles, and triangles are only representing like a small section of a 2D plane. And when they're arranged, we get the sense of 3D, right? But real life particles of light will, enter a surface, they'll bounce off it, whatever, to give you reflection. But when they enter a surface, they will scatter around underneath it and maybe come back out the other at a different angle. And that gives us, like when you hold your hand up to light, you can see like along the edges that light will, go through your hand, and, depending upon your skin pigments, it'll have a different look for different people. But, it'll give that look of light coming through the side of something. It'll make it look semi-translucent. And in games, that is usually super heavily faked by using things like shadow maps and like screen space techniques, which can do it. A lot of games actually do it almost entirely in screen space, excluding things like ears, where they'll have like a little map there that'll make it work from even when the light is occluded off screen. But in ray tracing, we need a way to do that is actually efficient, and this is a hardware-based way to do it in real time that doesn't use machine learning, if I recall. So it is a new way, a technique to do subsurface scattering using hardware ray tracing. They only showed it off here mainly in, once again, Half-Life 2 RTX, where they're making these, it's going to be a showcase for whatever Nvidia stuff can do. But whether or not this is coming to other titles in the future, it's really hard to say. This is something Nvidia made.
So, Alex, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't retread some ground here on DLSS 4, because I think that's probably the most immediate, impactful thing that NVIDIA has to show us today, especially for users of older GeForce cards, but in particular with this new Blackwell series and MFG. So could you kind of go over the various improvements, the new transformer model for super resolution, the new machine learning based models for frame generation and indeed multi-frame generation, and
Right.
obviously the improvements to ray reconstruction, which would probably fall under that super resolution banner as well.
Right. So let's just run through super resolution and ray reconstruction first. The core difference here is they are upgrading the model from using convolutional neural network to a transformer model, and that is used for much more complex things usually, but here they're using it for visual images, real-time temporal amortization of frames to give anti-aliasing and a higher resolution in the end. And they were basically saying we're seeing a lack of improvement over time by using the previous model, so we're going to use this new one, and specifically for Blackwell, leverage the new, much more powerful in certain ways, Tensor cores. So it's going to be more expensive to run potentially, but increased quality. Now, I imagine with Blackwell, it'll be little to no performance hit versus the previous model because the tensor cores are so fast and there's so many of them that they're actually finishing execution before it's, like actually becomes a problem of frame time. But with the older GPUs, such as RTX 2000 and 3000, maybe 4000, depending upon what's happening, it could actually be a performance hit that is noticeable. We don't know yet until we have the cards on our hands, but there's a lot of demos out there. They have one specifically of Horizon Forbidden West where you can just see a lot more temporally stable detail on like the back of Aloy there, on like one of the packs on her back or whatever. And super resolution already looked really good, so it looking better is interesting. It's just like another win, I guess, in that case. But I think the one thing to mention is that it's coming out experimental first. They're going to allow you to change it in the NV app on a per game basis, I believe, whether you want to use the transformer or the CNN model in older games. But I think it's coming out experimental because they don't consider it like 100% ready yet in some ways. So there could be regressions for all that I know. But that's it for super resolution. Now for ray reconstruction, we had more issues with it. It was really good, but we had more issues with it in terms of quality. And based upon Rich's preview and our just hands-on looking at it there in the demos that we talked about before, it looks a lot better. And this is like a full-on replacement in that regard. It's getting rid of a lot of the smearing, over-sharpening, stylization issues that the original model had that we looked at in Cyberpunk as well as in Alan Wake. So this just looks like another straight win, but presumably a little bit more expensive on older RTX GPUs due to the fact that it is a new transformer model, which is apparently heavier. So yeah, ray reconstruction, super resolution. Then the big talking point, the controversial thing is frame generation, as always. And multi-frame gen here is the new thing with Blackwell RTX 5000. Basically, previously before you would have two real rendered frames, as you would maybe call them, and then by holding onto one of the frames and using
optical flow.
I always forget the name of this. You're good at this, Oliver. Optical flow processor in the previous GPUs, RTX 4000, as well as machine learning network and things like the motion vectors from the game. It would synthesize an in-between interpolated image, essentially. And that would potentially, in the best CPU limited scenario, give you 2x the frame rate. But because of the cost of this thing in real time, it would actually typically be in a GPU limited scenario, not 2x of whatever you could have previously had before without it. We thought the quality was good enough to be recommendable above 40 FPS usually, but also it was very game dependent. You could see more artifacts in different types of games. That's the way it was before with RTX 4000. Now, instead of just synthesizing one in-between frame, it can synthesize up to 3 in-between frames, like a 4x boost in total of the potential CPU limited frame rate maybe. And that is interesting. It is controversial because that is the way Nvidia is focusing their entire, I would say, performance profile and their advertising. They say things like RTX 5070 equals RTX 4090 because multi-frame gen exists, when, as we know, an RTX 4090 does not have 12 gigs of VRAM. The shading power is going to be completely different without MFG on. A lot of stuff is going to be different. So that's how NVIDIA is focusing it. But I would say subjectively, in my first impressions, it was very convincing. It didn't look bad or anything like that. It looked good. And another thing to just really harp on for the audience is that, you really shouldn't be turning this on within like the 30 FPS realm to start getting, above 100 FPS and things like that. This is really meant for the same kind of application cases as you would have previously. So above 40 FPS minimum, but preferably 60 and above. So this is the way to start filling out new types of monitors that are coming out, like 240 hertz or 165 or, even above that, 360, 480. So that's kind of like the real usage angle there for me. And that's how I would kind of describe it. But NVIDIA doesn't describe it that way. They describe it like as a whole on performance improvement, which is very different. In terms of just like subjectively, another thing to mention is that you are generating more frames, but they're still persisting on screen for the same amount of time the previous amount of frame gen would have, just divisibly. So you have to think about it like this, like in where there would have been one synthesized frame before in between being interpolated, now you could have up to three. So a lot of people are thinking like that this is like some sort of linear process where, every frame is equal. The thing is that this is not true. The higher you get up in frame rate, the less time they are persisting on screen. So the chance to notice issues in them is actually lower. And that is one thing that we have struggled with in our coverage of frame gen of all types, whether it be lossless scaling or FSR3, is to convey that, yes, a generated frame can have many issues in it, and they're easy to point out, but they are only on screen for X amount of time while rapidly strobing in between more perfect frames. So frame gen is really hard, and we can't show it off on YouTube, and it's really something you have to experience yourself to start super critiquing. But that's really about it. We'll talk more about this at the end when we get to like the kind of conclusion here. But DLSS 4, a lot of the SR and RR is like the big deal that I think for me, but a lot of the press and a lot of the Nvidia themselves are responsible for this. A lot of people are talking about multi-frame gen, and that is one of the bigger upgrades of Blackwell versus Ada Lovelace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, MFG, I think frame generation certainly proved its place in the echelon of modern computer graphics rendering in terms of delivering extremely high levels of fluidity in games that might be very challenging. Like I'm playing Star Wars Outlaws at the moment with frame generation. It's a very different experience to playing without frame generation, and I certainly couldn't enjoy the same settings and try to achieve higher frames without it. I just wanted to close out our little piece here before we get on to our little final discussion with a little bit of a focus on something a little bit off kilter, which is that Nvidia showed us a lot of generative AI demos in various game applications, which, like a lot of the tech we saw, isn't necessarily Blackwell specific, but should be fast on Blackwell. And they spent a lot of time covering these demos, so I thought I would quickly run through some of my brief takeaways. I did find a lot of these demos pretty interesting and compelling. We have some footage running on screen right now, I presume. And in Zoopunk, for instance, you can customize your ship through talking to a character and creating an image in real time there. And there are lots of other little applications. We had various showings of like hype men who would basically give you feedback in real time as you're playing a game, like a co-streamer there, or even an AI within a game who would be an AI teammate who would give you instructions, who would respond to things, who'd call out enemies, all those things running locally. I think those are interesting applications, but NVIDIA's focus here was really on local AI, right? Obviously because they want to sell graphics cards. And I think it's interesting, but local AI, I'm not sure that local AI will be the future of these kinds of things, because just to get a simple LLM up and running, even a small one, even in like a Llama 3 billion or something, Llama 3B, it's going to cost you gigabytes of RAM, of VRAM. It's not going to run on consoles. It's not going to run on a lot of consumer GPUs that might be more VRAM limited. Think of all the 6 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte GPUs that are out there. Right. It's going to be tough to run on those GPUs in many games. Maybe you could process part of it locally. Like if you look at a text-to-speech model, they can fit in hundreds of megabytes of RAM quite easily. So perhaps you could do that, but not everything. So I kind of personally, my own personal takeaway on this is that I think for games in particular, you're likely to see indie games built around local AI before you see big budget games built around local AI. And I think that in general, outside of neat little demos and add-on features on top of games that already exist that are big budget titles, I think it's a little bit tougher to see that application of local AI. I think it's much more likely in the short to medium term that people are going to cloud providers and are tapping out some GPUs, because to make a big game, you kind of need to scale across the vast array of hardware, from Steam Deck on the one end to PS5 in the middle to 5090 at the top end. You can't just be there with the 5090s and the 4080s and stuff. I don't really think that's plausible for people who are trying to make, a commercially successful video game product. Right. But on the creator side, I think it's potentially a lot more interesting, because FP4 acceleration in particular is going to get people really, really excited. It means a ton for a lot of workloads. but only memory light workloads are going to work really well. Like that needs people need to keep that in mind. Like if you want to run a large language model, a big one, you still want like a Mac with 192 gigabytes of memory. But for stuff like graphic stuff, imaging tools, stuff like that, 32 gigs is a pretty good amount of memory. And obviously the 5090 will be very fast. So I just kind of wanted to, I wanted to throw in a little bit of cold water on a few things here. Like I think it is an interesting card for creators who are interested in experimenting with AI for different purposes, but also people need to keep in mind like there are some categories of tasks that are relatively RAM light that work really well, and then other categories of tasks where you still want to go to the cloud and there's really no consumer hardware that can serve that purpose, or the consumer hardware that can serve that purpose is like computers that are wired to a massive amount of RAM. Ultimately here, I think we do want to have a little bit of a wrap-up discussion on these cards here, because I think that, I think actually the price versus performance of the cards, if we take away all the stuff about neural rendering, if we take away all the stuff about multi-frame generation, if we take away any future expectations of performance and just focus on the pure now, I actually think that price versus performance with these cards is surprisingly decent, because they are coming in at or around the cost of those existing GPU lines, except for the 5090. And the 5090 is again extending you past the level of the 4090 rather, into a new bracket of performance where it is compelling in that sense at 2,000 American dollars. And I personally think that here, NVIDIA's actually done a pretty good job in terms of price versus performance, but I don't know how you feel there, Alex. Accepting these technologies, how do you feel about price versus performance?
So like
here?
accepting all the stuff that we talked about here, and we're just looking at like if we were to run a rasterized title versus on this gen card and the previous gen card, we would see almost like what I would describe as like a refresh level of performance in a previous generation context, like the best refresh level, like this isn't the good example, like 1070 to 1070 Ti or 2070 to 2070 Super, the best level of refresh where you're getting for an extremely similar price of like a 15 to 20% boost or something like that. And that is like a good refresh level, but it is definitely not within the expectations, I would say, of what you would see gen on gen 10 years ago or something like that. And well, yeah, 10 years ago, roughly 10 years ago to 15 years ago, time is advancing. Don't forget that. And I think this is one of the things that consumers are struggling the most with. And I think it's reasonable to struggle with this on a certain level because, inflation and the fact that you can only get so much into these smaller manufacturing processes. This is not like a large node jump or something like that. So the card can only get better in certain ways. And NVIDIA puts it out for a price that they think people will buy. Now, not everyone will buy it at that price. And we've seen that before with the RTX 4080, which did not sell at all very well. And so they had to bring out the 4080 Super, which it was essentially a price cut in terms of how much performance per dollar you were getting there. We'll see what ends up happening here. But in the immediate term, I would say this is not a GPU series you should upgrade to if you have a good RTX 4000 GPU. I think that's like the lay of the land in that general direction. That's typically how it is for most generations of GPU, though, for a while now. You don't just buy a new GPU every 2 years when they come out. Most people don't. So I don't think that's too surprising. But if you were one of those people who was buying a new GPU every 2 years because 3,000 to 4,000, 4,000 to 5,000, well, then this is disappointing if you only look at it in the rasterization, pure performance metric of that. But that is not what NVIDIA is advertising their cards are. And it's also arguably not the way computing is going to be going. And it is not going that way. Rich talked with, you talked with Mark Cerny. And I was about to say, Rich, you talked with Mark Cerny. And he very explicitly said, like, we're not going to be getting these massive teraflop increases in our GPU. There's a limit to how much fast memory we can put in these things. Before it becomes price inefficient to sell to a consumer at something sub 1,000 US dollars, right? And the same thing is applying to GPUs right now, and it is a hard pill to swallow. But at least in this aspect, NVIDIA is coming up with alternative branches of computing and ways of advancing computing that more readily leverage the hardware we can increase. And I think stuff like neural rendering is a future workload that is very interesting. For the cards
Yeah.
themselves, though, like this 12 gigabyte, 16 gigabyte thing, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, there's never going to be enough frame buffer for some of these low end cards. I fear that's kind of a perennial problem. Hopefully, I mean, 8 gigabytes is going to see probably, may possibly, according to the leaks, possibly return with the 5060,
That
which
would
will be a
be
greater
not a good
issue.
thing. That would make me very
Yeah,
sad, actually.
that'll make Alex tear his hair out slightly. Me to try to tear my hair out, but I think here, yeah, those the baseline performance improvement here, I think is like you know, it is what it is. Seeing as we're not getting a big node jump, I think people kind of forget just how big the node jump from Samsung 8 nanometers to TSMC 5 was with last generation. That was like gigantic. It's almost like two full nodes of a performance improvement, or 1.5 nodes. It was a big performance improvement. And I think that even as we go, we're not at the 3 nanometer node for consumer GPUs yet, but I think what we're seeing from other areas of the silicon industry is that scaling from this point onwards is getting a lot harder, a lot more expensive, and less compelling. So I think we should get very used to these kinds of improvements in features and not so much in raw rendering capability or in brute force rendering capability, as Nvidia sometimes puts it. For the frame generation features, I think it's possibly quite compelling. I think we need to really see exactly how it looks in practice here and exactly how much scaling it gives these cards above their prior generation companions, above the 3000 series. Because for me, like I do have a pretty high refresh rate monitor. I have a 170 hertz monitor. To maximize that monitor, you'd be thinking with one of these new cards, maybe running at 40 FPS internally and going to like 160 FPS ish with frame generation, or perhaps something more conservative with just 3x frame generation there. So to make use of it with a higher end card, I think people have sketched out an idea in their heads of, okay, I'll get like a 240 hertz monitor, or I'll get a 200 hertz monitor or something in that range and use frame gen from like 60 hertz, 50 hertz base frame rate. I think that makes a lot of sense. As we go down the stack, the potential of frame generation technology in improving frame rates becomes bigger, but also the internal frame rates that you'll need to achieve in order to achieve like realistic refresh rates for that class of hardware becomes lower and lower. So I think there are certain trade-offs here, maybe with multi-frame generation, that will show up in these cards, where like right now, I'm very comfortable enabling frame generation on almost any game on my system currently. I feel like it provides a good experience. I'm happy with that. For multi-frame generation, is there that same utility? Certainly at very high refresh rates, but for kind of like this mid-range to high-end hardware, it's gonna be interesting to see how that shakes out, because it's not a pure performance increase, like Rich says. It's an FPS increase primarily, right? It's not.
Right.
It's kind of a performance increase, kind of not. It's giving you that fluidity. It's not giving you that decrease in input latency. It's not necessarily giving you a totally artifact-free experience. So I think we'll have to see how that works out in practice. That's a trickier subject to address, but it could be very compelling for sure. I imagine for some categories of products, it will end up being very compelling. But that's not the only aspect of this new graphics card that is interesting here, because we also have some discussion here of NVIDIA's unique software package and experience with DLSS 4, with neural rendering, that possibly is elevating them above their competition to some degree. So how much value should we attach to that
Right.
kind of NVIDIA package of features? Probably talking about multi-frame generation here, but also all the other DLSS suite of technology of features, Reflex, now Reflex 2, neural rendering features of different kinds. Like there's a lot to
Yeah.
offer here.
So I think I would say this is the way NVIDIA frames it. But you as a consumer, you should really look at your own priorities. And these things are incredible from a future looking perspective, the neural rendering and whatnot. But they are limited to a certain subset of games that will only be coming out in the next like 3 years at most, and it'll be a very small subset of them. So you have to look at like your gaming catalog. And when you do that, and the type of games you play, you may see that something like the RTX 50 series doesn't apply to you. And that's totally fine. You don't need to get FOMO and start wanting to buy it as a result just because it's the latest and greatest. In that aspect. Another thing is that some of these are force multipliers for spec problems, I would call them, on the current GPUs. Like the neural texture compression actually sounds amazing if there is a card of 5070 caliber with 12 gigabytes of VRAM. That sounds amazing. It would be a perfect way to make sure that this card can actually run the latest titles without turning settings down. Same with DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, where it's going to improve the refresh rate responsiveness on your display for your eyes, etc., at the cost of input latency potentially versus not having it on. And the new DLSS 4 model for frame generation uses less VRAM. I think they touted at 4K 400 megabytes less, for example. So those features technically make lower VRAM mounts more compelling, but they are not in every game out there. DLSS 4 is not in every game out there. This neural texture compression would be amazing if it was in every single game, but it isn't, and it isn't currently. And I kind of feel like the RTX 5000 series here is a little bit more niche of an upgrade, and as a result, it's a little bit like RTX 2000 when it released in 2018, where the sell is a bit harder because the software isn't there yet, and we need a greater industry adoption of the software. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I see it at the moment, but I'm still very excited to see all these next gen technologies at the same time. But I don't know, the price performance thing, we as an industry are going to need to find out a way to start talking about things beyond just FPS, because the experience that our GPUs can offer us now is a lot more than things that aren't just about FPS. It's about image quality, it is about input response, and it is about smoothness, maybe. And I kind of felt like Nvidia's angle there was smart, but it is definitely very calculated to make sure you think this is an incredible buy. So,
I also think it's tricky because I think Nvidia has a great platform here in terms of these technologies, but most of them are still coming to 4,000 and 3,000 and
very
even
important.
2,000. So maybe the performance isn't there to run all these new features on an RTX 2060, but gosh darn it, Nvidia will let you do it. So I would just say that like the Nvidia platform at this point, stretching back for 6 years of graphics technologies, basically over 6 years of graphics technologies, they're going to take care of you. They're going to give you most of these features, not all these features, but most of these features are going to run, many of them in a performant manner on that class of hardware. And you probably have some confidence that this graphics card that you buy in 2025 is going to be supported with new features into 2027, into 2029. You're kind of buying into this NVIDIA platform. They're showing extremely good, almost Apple-like support for these older GPUs at this point, which I think is very encouraging. Other vendors aren't necessarily at this level. Like DLSS 4 runs on a 2070, but FSR 4 won't even run on like a 2022 RX 7900 or anything like that. So that's kind of a disappointment there. NVIDIA has obviously been a little bit more future looking, but I totally take on board the fact that like a lot of these technologies won't be deployed in games for a while. People need to temper their expectations. You look at something like Mega Geometry, who knows how long it'll take for that to be integrated in a game in kind of a manner like we saw in the NVIDIA demos there.
Precisely.
A lot of these technologies can probably be integrated a little bit faster, like with the RTX Hair, but some things will take a little bit more time there. So I guess closing out here, we have a little bit of a point here, which is how do we review hardware and how do we think about graphics technology in an era where people debate even what performance is in graphics hardware because of the proliferation of various fake frames, as they're pejoratively called, or AI generated frames, frame generation, these kinds of technologies that I think are becoming very, very important to the PC experience, but also engender a ton of controversy. And the normal way of benchmarking PC parts is to test them with ISO settings against each other in the same workloads and do a performance per dollar chart and call it a day. But I think that's changing quite a bit now here, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, and I think we just talked about it essentially, like the manufacturing is making this the way it is right now. And I think the reviews, you can obviously look at any review what you want, but if it was just focusing on FPS only, it wouldn't be describing a lot of the rest of the software package that the GPU might be offering you. And I think there is indeed a way forward, and it's not looking at the typical ISO settings, things that you mentioned for GPU reviews ever since the 90s. But it's looking a little bit about like maybe how you would review a car, or you would review, any or sort of luxury product. And GPUs are a luxury product. You don't need to have a GPU for the most part. And I think looking at those, where if they just say how quickly it goes from 0 to 60, or how like braking distance, or I don't know, you're not getting much there out of a review. But if you look at like safety features, media features in a car, like the expanded palette and like a larger subjective take, a holistic take of the product, that's how you would maybe inform the consumer best, especially considering the manufacturing things we talked about earlier. But that's kind of the way I see it right now. DF has been pretty good in going this direction because we have a different slant, but the rest of the industry doesn't necessarily have that, because consoles were limited enough where we had to create a new angle to talk about them. But GPUs haven't been this way for a long time, so I'm very curious to see how other GPU reviewers will go about it. Image quality comparisons, I have no idea. It's their own, they will create up some of their own things. But for now, I think we're going to be pretty equipped for talking about this future, but I'm very curious to see how other people maybe come up with new angles to talk about it. There was battle nonsense a few years ago. That was a really interesting angle that kind of fell off, like the input latency one, but maybe that will start entering the discussion more and more.
I think Alex just came up with a better analogy than I did, because I was just going to compare graphics cards to consoles. But I think that the car analogy is maybe a little bit more fitting there, because you have the fit, you have the finish, you have all these features, you can kind of live in it, you can see the world through it. I think it's a more compelling analogy there. But, it is very much something where you aren't just comparing parts per parts. You're not comparing like flow rate here. You're not comparing throughput. You're not comparing things like this. We're not comparing like filters or fans or things that can be just measured in an absolute sense. We're comparing different platforms that come with their own unique hardware and software features, aren't available on other platforms, or to the extent they are available, they're available in very different forms. And so to some degree, like when you're trying to reconcile different cards together, you have to think about exactly how am I using this card, and are the various vendors' different software packages attractive to me for my own uses. I think that's a key part of it now. I don't think that a ton of this is going to come down to performance per dollar in native rendering. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that gamers are very much there, because like Nvidia has internal telemetry that says that 80% of gamers with an RTX capable GPU are using DLSS in their titles. So apparently people do tend to make use of these technologies, which I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, I think more optimistically, I think AMD and Intel are pursuing similar technologies to Nvidia. I'm sure that something like FSR4 is hopefully going to be more comparable to modern day DLSS than FSR2 was to DLSS 3 or FSR3 was to DLSS 3. But I do hope that we basically get to a point in the PC industry where we have broad parity in terms of features, at least having the features across different kinds of hardware, where we have a multi-frame generation solution from AMD, from Intel, where we have something like a Reflex 2 solution that's kind of extrapolative, generative fill, interesting latency reduction solution across vendors, things like that. But for now, it's definitely a little bit more of a tough thing to review hardware. And I do think you need to put each card in its own context of what you can do with it. What's the limit of what you can do with that card? What's the kind of typical gameplay experience of using that card? How would you typically use that card in conjunction with super resolution, in conjunction with frame generation, in conjunction with reflex, in conjunction with all these technologies to enable the best experience on any class of card? I think that's a tougher discussion.
Yeah,
that for sure I think we do a pretty good job at that, but it's a tough discussion for sure. Okay, so I think that's enough Blackwell discussion for one day, Alex.
That was a long one.
Yeah, certainly we had a very interesting time in the NVIDIA briefing, and I think we've had a pretty interesting time discussing Blackwell's ins and outs and all the new software features from NVIDIA and the different levels of performance that people can expect in broad strokes. But hopefully we'll have a little bit more in-depth content on upcoming Blackwell GPUs in the near future. Obviously, we have various Blackwell launches scheduled for January and February at this point. So hopefully we can get a little bit more detail on those GPUs when they do arrive. But until that occurs, please check out the Digital Foundry Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. Please check out our merchandising wares at store.digitalfoundry.net for our latest t-shirts and mugs and XXL mouse pads and other such goods. And from me and Alex, we'll sign off with
Oh,
Auf Wiedersehen.